Well, hello and welcome, everybody. Welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Wolf Institute in Cambridge. My name is Dr. Julian Hargreaves. I'm the Director of Research here at the Wolf Institute, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all. So the purpose of this webinar is to introduce you to a recently completed project, the Measures of Success project. And the main business of the project was the development of a toolkit to help local community groups who are engaged in some aspect of interfaith work to measure their impact and effectiveness. You'll hear tonight from three guest speakers, and one of them is our very own Dr. Catherine Alone, who was the lead researcher on the Measures of Success project. We also hear tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Jen Lindsay, and Dr. Lindsay is an award-winning social scientist, documentary filmmaker and musician whose work explores an array of topics: social diversity, community building, personal transformation and social change movements. She completed her doctoral degree in social science of religion at Boston University and is currently a professor at the University of California, Rome Study Center, and also at the John Cabot University as a lecturer in sociology. I'm also very happy to welcome a good friend of the Institute, Saravapadya, who is currently the research manager for learning and evaluation at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Having grown up in Nepal in the midst of civil war, he is driven by the desire to examine and address root causes of conflict. He was previously a fellow at the American Friends Service Committee, where he worked on designing and implementing monitoring and evaluation framework and tools that help capture processes and results of peacebuilding and dialogue programs. So the schedule for this evening is that Kitty, Dr. Catherine Alone, will present to you an overview and a summary of the Measures of Success project and the toolkit. And then we'll hand over to our two speakers. So all three will speak for 5 minutes each. Then we'll have a kind of guided talk, a facilitated discussion, which hopefully will delve a little bit deeper into some of the topics raised in the presentations. And then we'll open up the floor for questions. And at the end of tonight's webinar, I'm very pleased to say that we'll be showing one of Jen's animated videos, which we're all very much looking forward to seeing. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kitty. Thanks, Kitty.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Hello. As Julian said, I was the lead researcher on the Measures of Success project, which has now been completed, which is an extraordinary feat. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project, what it involved, and the process that we went through of sort of designing the indicators and designing the actual evaluation framework that is the end result of the project. So if I ask Flora to very kindly load up my first slide. Here we go. So the Measures of Success project started over 2 years ago now at the Wolf Institute. And the goal was really to design and develop a set of indicators to assess the effectiveness of interfaith dialogue. And I always say this, but it took me about 2 weeks before I realized the enormity of that task. And the end result, I'm very pleased to say, is now available online, free of charge, available for all on the Wolf Institute website. And it's a toolkit, and the toolkit for measuring success of interfaith projects at the grassroots level primarily. So one of the first things that I did when I started the project was really trying to assess what practitioners ideas and experiences of success look like. So, for example, people involved in interfaith work in the UK, what did it mean for interfaith to be successful? What was their perception of an effective project? What did it look like? And although there was obviously a diverse sort of range of attitudes and opinions, several things became apparent, several things there was some uniformity in their responses. And what struck me and delighted me as a psychologist was that for these people, successful interfaith involves some kind of psychological change in participants. So for it to work, for it to be effective, there must be some kind of attitudinal change in participants, for example, or the breaking down of very black and white thinking was something that was often referenced. And as a psychologist, this is something that can be quite easily measured, I think, with the use of scales, validated scales that you can take from the literature. But what became apparent was that success in interfaith has more than just a psychological component to it. The people who undertake this project and this work are looking for more than just attitudinal change in the participants that are involved in the project. Ultimately, what they're hoping for is for some kind of community level change. They're hoping for these changes to seep out and have an impact at the broader level within the wider community. And for me, this was where the real interest lay. So how is it? How does this process of what is termed transfer take place? How is it that an individual change in a participant's attitude or perceptions of another religious outgroup, how does that single change, that psychological level change, go on to trigger change in a much broader context? So the way that we broke down this very daunting concept of success, so if we go on to the second slide now, Flora, I think we should say, was to be very reductionist about it, to break success down into 3 clearly defined domains. So for us, the evaluation framework that we've devised comprises of these 3 domains. The first of which, as I mentioned, is the psychological domain of success. So here we employ pre and post testing methodology, and it's really relatively easy to do in terms of a structured survey or focus group. And what you can do is take pre-initiative responses from participants and compare them with the ones taken at the end. And what you'd expect to find would be changes in particular variables or indicators. The second domain of success, which is something I alluded to just now, is the community domain. So as I said, people engaged in interfaith work do it in the assumption and the very strong belief that it can lead to much broader changes in society, rather than just the, for example, 20 people who attend the project. And then at the very top of the hierarchy, we have the societal level, or the societal domain of success. And what you'd be tracking here would be very long-term, longue durée approaches to change. So this could be something a 10-year longitudinal study looking at policy change, for example. So really, for the toolkit that we developed, which was designed primarily for grassroots organizations, the 2 domains of interest really are going to be the psychological domain and the community level domain. So Flora, if we go on to slide 3, you can see that we've really taken this reductionist approach and run with it. So what we've done is broken down each domain into 3 elements, making it hypothetically much easier to measure. The idea being taking something very broad and scary like success, breaking it down into its constituent parts makes it much easier to measure and easier to be clear and definite about what we're talking about. So for example, the psychological domain of success is broken down into these 3 elements, and within each element there are a series of outcomes. And now at this level, it becomes much easier then to develop and design indicators to measure the progress that we're having. So if we go on to slide 4, you can see one example of the indicators that we've suggested. So strength of attachment to religious community. And this is something that a lot of practitioners were very interested in. And I had 2 sides to this. So for the more conservative minded people, or the more conservative faith communities, there is often a hesitancy about engaging in interfaith, because breaking outside of the community might well undermine religious faith. It might well cause confusion within your own religious identity. But on the other hand, you have a lot of practitioners who argue that it's precisely the opposite, that engaging with people of different faiths does actually bolsters your own religious faith. And so we wanted to include the strength of attachment to religious community, for example, as an indicator to measure exactly what's happening to this variable throughout the course of a project. And the approach that I took was arguably completely biased, because I am a psychologist. So I went to what I know best, which is the psychological literature. And what I did was sort of take out pre-validated, robust measures and adapt them slightly for use in the interfaith domain. So here we have something that's often used in the psychological literature. It's originally a measure that's used to capture changes in what's called identity fusion. So this is people's sense of self correlating with their sense of group identity. And based on focus groups and sort of discussions with practitioners and participants, we adapted it slightly. So we reduced it from its original form, which was 5 selections, down to A through to D, which makes it much easier as a participant, I think. And also what we like to do, we're saying that by using pictorial items, this is something that's very easy to transfer into different contexts, particularly if some of the participants, for example, English is not their first language. And this was something that was quite common in the interfaith projects that I observed in the UK. So how am I doing for time? Let me have a look. I think I've got enough now to take you onto the next slide, which should be looking at the next level of success. And again, you can see it's exactly the same recipe. Take the domain, break it down into elements, and those elements sort of consist of different outcomes. And it's at this level that we can provide indicators for each of these outcomes. And I think if we go on to the next slide, oh no, we don't. So this is actually a much harder domain, I found at least, to measure effectiveness. And this is, of course, the domain that funders and practitioners are interested in. It's like, how can we show that the work that we're doing is having an impact at the community level? And it's incredibly hard to do. So we've suggested some indicators, but I have no doubt that as the field of interfaith progresses and moves to a more systematic model of evaluation, that these community level indicators will evolve as well. And that is ultimately the hope of the toolkit. This provides grassroots communities, grassroots interfaith projects with a starting point for evaluation. And that from this base, we can really build the knowledge so that this model of systematic evaluation is really built in from the very beginning in all interfaith activity. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Right, thank you, Kitty. I'm sure that will have raised a few questions among people watching. And if you do have any questions, I did forget to say at the beginning, please do add them into our chat function, and I'll try and round them up at the end of the presentations. All our information about the toolkit is publicly available, free of charge. So if there's anything that you want to go over again with our help, if needs be, then get in touch. We're happy to share the toolkit. It's available on our website, and I'm sure Kitty's also happy to share some of the slides. Okay, well, moving swiftly on, it's a great pleasure for me to present and open the floor for Saurav. Saurav, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julian, and thanks to Wolf Institute and also Kitty for doing such amazing work. And I'm really honored to be here to speak with you today. So I'm gonna, my task today, I think it will be to try and place Kitty's amazing work in the context of sort of the wider peace building evaluation field. As Julian pointed out, my name is Saravapadya, and I'm the research manager for learning and evaluation at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. To give you a bit of a background, the Alliance for Peacebuilding is a membership network of more than 150 plus peacebuilding organizations based in over 180 plus countries. We basically have 3 areas of work. The first area of work is our memberships and partnerships area of work. The second area of work, which is where I work, and this is the learning and evidence, soon to be called Learning and Evidence, but we have the Learning and Evidence unit, which works on learning, evaluation, and evidence in the peace building field. And then our third area of work is our policy and advocacy work, which is also very intimately connected with the membership and partnership, of course, and also the learning and evidence area of work. My role within the learning and evidence team is to mostly support religious and interreligious organizations with design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning efforts, as well as design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning activities. So what does that mean? To give you an example, more specifically, alongside Kitty, I help facilitate a peer learning community of organizations that are involved in interreligious dialogue initiatives. This is like one part of my work. And in this learning community that Kitty and I are part of, we foster sort of peer-to-peer relationship amongst interreligious dialogue practitioners. We help build knowledge of best practices, identify and address challenges in interreligious dialogue. Not just that, but also challenges in monitoring, evaluation, and learning of interreligious dialogue. And the whole point of sort of organizing this learning community is so that we can then contribute our knowledge of best practices and lessons learned with the wider interfaith movement. So we focus on monitoring, evaluation, and learning within this community because the interreligious dialogue field struggles from a substantial lack of knowledge about effective approaches. We know that interreligious dialogue interventions have played a positive role in mitigating and preventing conflicts. And while some evaluations of interreligious dialogue initiatives have taken place, the field as a whole has lacked the tools, experience, and the evidence to understand what approaches are most effective, what works, what doesn't work, and things of that nature. So, we think that understanding effectiveness is really important especially with regards to interreligious dialogue, because there are a broad range of approaches and techniques that are currently practiced, and they're practiced in a wide variety of contexts, right? So they're practiced in different geographical, political, and social contexts. So which is why, we think, alongside Kitty, I do this work, we think that supporting organizations with their evaluation efforts is so important because we can collect and then provide evidence to donors, policymakers, as well as the wider interfaith movement about, what's working, why is it working, so that, policymakers promote interfaith engagement as a way to build sustainable peace. Donors fund interfaith work, and also interfaith organizations adopt good practices and do no harm and things of that nature. So, this is why sort of evaluations, I think, are really important on a structural sort of and a policy level, but evaluations are also important on an organizational level, right? Like all practitioners, and I think this is especially true for a lot of interfaith dialogue and interfaith peace building practitioners, all of them want to know about whether their work is making a difference, has it created change? And for me, understanding that is in essence the basis of evaluation. And people often try to make evaluations into these really complicated or technocratic practice when it's not. Evaluations are simply a really structured way of answering questions that an interfaith, grassroots interfaith practitioners may have about their projects. And this is important because, like I said, we're all reflective people, and it's always good to have answers to those questions, right? Now, having said that, evaluating, assessing, measuring impact of interfaith initiatives is not easy. This is because, as I sort of alluded to earlier, interfaith programs are very context dependent. They involve long timeframes, and which is not usually able to abide by predetermined project cycles. So for example, the interfaith dialogue projects that Kitty and I sort of support, some of them have been going on for 10 years, so they usually do not fall neatly into project cycles that are usually sort of taken up by donors. And also, this is a reality all of the interfaith programs, they actually occur within really complex and really fast changing dynamics, and also involve multiple human factors that are very intangible. So, this is why assessing impact of interfaith initiatives is so difficult, because it involves capturing changes in a range of elusive factors like beliefs, values, spiritualities, and many things like that. So, having said that, having said how difficult it is something that can be done. And this measures of success toolkit that Kitty just put out is an example of how it can be done. And this is why I think this is so helpful, because it's really geared towards like community and grassroots interfaith practitioners, and it can help guide them in an interactive and easy to follow way on how to do monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And it shows them that this does not have to be this really technocratic thing. This can be something that you can do yourselves. You can reflect on yourselves and do it, so that you can prove your impact, show your impact, learn, and share it with the wider interfaith field. I don't know how I'm doing. I think I'm running out of time. So that's what I'll say for now, and I'll hand it over to Julian. But thank you again for having me. Yeah, wonderful to be here.
Saurav, thank you so much for that. Really valuable insights into your work and into interfaith more generally. And as such an important member of the peer learning community that you described, and on behalf of Wolf Institute, I just wanted to thank you, for the support that you gave Kitty and the project. I know Kitty's taken great benefit from your expertise and insight in shaping the project, but in also helping us to review the final toolkit. So yeah, a really warm thank you from the Wolf Institute. So last but by no means least, now I'd like to hand the floor over to Jen Lindsay. Jen, over to you.
Okay, great. Can you guys hear me? Is my mic running okay? Okay, great. So hi, I'm Jen Lindsay. I'm a lecturer in sociology and communications at John Cabot University in Rome. And I came to Rome initially to study interreligious dialogue here. And the question that I was so hungry to answer at the beginning of my research was very much changed by the process of researching measurement and evaluation in interfaith dialogue. I brought to my research the kind of sort of impatience with interfaith dialogue that came out of, sort of like wanting to know what difference could it possibly make? Like a bunch of people getting together and talking, or running a soup kitchen together, or having a Ramadan iftar or a Passover Seder, like, why should we do that? And so I came in with guns ablazing to the Rome Interfaith Society, which is what I sort of ended up calling the cluster of interfaith organizations and level of interfaith dimensions here, from the institutional to the grassroots levels and the nonprofit groups. I came in with guns ablazing with my psychometrics and my questionnaires and my longitudinal studies that I'd set up. And I just really wanted to know, to be able to quantify somehow and evaluate what interfaith dialogue could change. And I asked about program benchmarks, concrete progress indications, membership levels, all this kind of stuff. And what I found is that people were very irritated by these questions, very exasperated. And it was as if I was coming to a wedding and saying, but how much do you love each other and how can you prove it? Or as if I was walking into a Methodist church and saying, but how many of your congregants have gone to heaven? It was almost that my presence as a measurer of what they were doing, because they were doing it because it was like the morally right thing to do. And here I was trying to prove whether it was actually right or useless, seemed actually fundamentally offensive to these people. And I started realizing that approaching interfaith dialogue with a measurement mindset serves a purpose chiefly when it comes to funding interfaith dialogue programs. But when you actually start to talk to dialoguers and leaders of dialogue communities, it's a very partial conveyance of the heart of what they're actually doing. Assessed by impact, dialogue is only partially assessed. This was what I came to after 18 months of starting to realize over time that all my questions about evaluation were ringing hollow to people, probably because they were tired of having to write out metrics in grant applications and somehow justify their moral stance to funders and investors, because they really, interfaithers, they talk a lot about social change and transformation and really cloudy but ubiquitous concepts like mutual recognition. But it is actually very rare that these things are clearly defined, that success is defined, that benchmarks are defined, or even more, that they have a strategy for achieving social change or personal transformation or mutual recognition, which, I mean, this whole concept of mutual recognition just drives me absolutely bonkers, because both of my studies of dialoguers in Rome and in Israel and Palestine, I kept hearing this. We want to establish mutual recognition. Do you? What does that mean to you? I'm going to write a measure. I'm going to try to understand how frequently you mention it. Can you define it? How would you know if you had achieved it? And it was a disaster. Every time I tried to measure a faith statement, essentially, that these people were something that they were collectively striving for as a matter of shared sacred values, but not necessarily a destination. And one day in the field during my studies, one of my dialoguers said, she said, I was asking some questions about measurement and impact and the product of dialogue or something. And she looks at me and she says, the product of dialogue is dialogue. That's it. She said, I come to these things, I don't really learn anything that changes my life. I don't really grow that much, but I see my friends. It's meaningful. We build our friendship, more memories together. We're operating on a different axis than product and impact. And I know everybody here knows this, right? And that this is the whole thing that we're getting at, is what is the weird alchemy of what we're supposed to measure, how we're supposed to measure it in order to get those grant dollars in, right? To fund the donuts and the orange juice that the interfaith community is attracting people with. But the point that I really want to make or drive home through all my conversations about measurement in the field of dialogue is really that it is such a partial way to understand dialogue. And because if you think of dialogue as a company that has a product or a service that can be evaluated, maybe it's appropriate to think of it like that. But I realized that was the wrong understanding of dialogue, because interfaith communities are more actually they're moral communities, just like Emil Durkheim defined religion. People gathering on the basis of shared sacred values and achieving solidarity and closeness and meaning making and the deepening of relationships through the repeated invocation of their shared sacred goals, like social change, pluralism, mutual recognition, whatever these things are, and however they're constructed in that interfaith dialogue moment. It doesn't even really matter in concrete terms what these things are, because these people are becoming closer to each other merely through the ritualistic repeated invocation of the values they share together, almost as a religious act. So I have a quote that I pulled out of my research to share with you guys that I thought you might be amused by. It was a dialogue member of the group Istituto Tevere here in Rome, a Turkish Muslim group. And I asked him about evaluating impact, and he said, how do we evaluate progress? We don't count people. We're just trying to sincerely offer this place for people to get to know each other. When we went to go learn about program evaluation and think about translating activities into a concrete report, we realized that one day we would have 5 people, and sometimes there would be 50, and sometimes there would be 5, or sometimes we would forget to count because we didn't have enough donuts and we were stressed out. So our report never actually reflected our real activities, and it didn't reflect how meaningful it was to those of us who were running the group. It's not black and white, but we're not lazy about evaluation and numbers. We just think it sends the wrong message. Numbers tell a story that isn't even true and that doesn't capture our essence. So I'm here to confound the discussion and remind us that both religious groups and interreligious groups have these discursive ideals of social change and pluralism and mutual recognition and transformation that are more rewarding and more achievable in their repeated discursive invocation than they are actually measurable. You know, counting people that go to heaven is not possible. Funders still want to know why they should donate money to a ballet company or, you know, a museum or a dialogue group. So we do have to construct this dance of talking about return on investment, social return on investment, but we always must keep in mind that this is a very partial assessment. And it probably comes out of a modern anxiety that I certainly have, and I think other people in modern, successful, smart people like we all are here, have this anxiety to be able to know that we're effective, that we have some control of our lives, that we have some potential to add something good and beautiful to this hard, confusing world. And I think that's part of the whole measuring thing, is we want to know that we're doing something that matters. But the ultimate, I guess, existential message that I took out of my studies is that we can't know. And people do dialogue as an act of faith. And they do dialogue because they found people that also value social change, pluralism, mutual recognition, and they achieve life-giving inspiration from spending time with other people like that. But we don't actually know really if dialogue changes the world, but I can say that it changes the worlds of individuals who participate, but measuring only tells part of the story. So I'll end on another quote from Leo Tolstoy. He says, "Human science fragments everything in order to understand it and kills it in order to examine it." This is a tragic approach to measurement. And again, it's not useless, but I also recognize that there are economic necessities in the world, and dialogue groups have to do this dance and bend over backward to express themselves in the language that funders speak. But we always have to maintain this sort of meta awareness that this is a somewhat artificial activity that only partially represents the activity that's actually being undertaken. And it's a frustrating endeavor full of irresolvable paradoxes. And that's what I have to say. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jen. That was really interesting. That really kind of stirs up the debate, doesn't it? It really helps us think about lots of different aspects, really, of interfaith work from the kind of corporate funding perspective that I think you've sort of quite successfully sort of discussed and challenged in a way, and also the whole idea of measurement. So, in the sort of spirit of dialogue and sort of respectful engagement, I just wondered how Kitty and Saurav sort of might respond to that. Is measurement just about sort of satisfying an appetite amongst corporate funders? Is there a way of sort of marrying these two worlds together? Kitty, Saurav, is there perhaps also something to be said about less corporate funders, so initiatives within the public sector? Is it just about, sort of big financial, powerful individuals signing checks? Is it also about people in charities wanting to improve their work? How do you respond to what's just been said?
So I think I might jump in. I hope you don't mind, Saurav. Thank you, Jen, for that. I was so excited about you being on the webinar because I loved your sort of anti-measurement stance, which was basically the whole premise of the Measures of Success project. So one of the things that came through quite clearly in interviews that I did with interfaith practitioners in the UK was that they recognized that measurement and evaluation was sort of a necessary evil. They didn't want to do it. They were sort of, in some cases, quite reluctant to do it and didn't really I'm sure you've encountered this too, perhaps you too as well, Saurav. There are people who said to me, the changes that happen in interfaith are so sort of profound and nuanced that they can't possibly lend themselves to any kind of quantification anyway. It's just not possible. But what they did recognize was that we need a language, a quantitative language that we can communicate with our funders with. So there is a massive disconnect, I would say, between the wants of funders who understandably want things in metrics and quantifiable terms. You know, I would too if I was putting in, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And there was this mismatch from the interfaith community, I think, as you mentioned, the interfaith community, which was very much that, yes, this is an act of faith. And to try and even measure this kind of stuff is, it sort of ranged the gamut from sort of baffled to sort of offended for some people. But they recognized that it was important. And one of them actually said to me, if you can find a way to articulate religiosity in a way that funders understand, that would be helpful to us. We don't want it to be like that, but that is the reality of conducting interfaith, particularly in the UK. I can't say what it's like in Rome, but in the UK, there really is this cold, hard reality that it's funder driven, and that to get funding, you need to provide some kind of evidence of impact. And after a while, I mean, perhaps this is something that everybody in interfaith feels at some point. You do kind of get to this point of existential, like suddenly it all just becomes totally meaningless. And you think, well, what is the point? You know, why are we playing this game, this weird ballet? And I went down that road a couple of times and then sort of lost faith in the whole measurement thing. And then sort of, I talked to somebody else who go, actually, it would be really useful to have a toolkit. And that kind of bolstered my enthusiasm again. So I completely see both sides of the story. And I think what we need is a happy medium. We need to be able to, as my interlocutor said, we need to be able to articulate faith and spirituality in a way that funders understand. And if this means a little bit of give and take on both sides, then I think ultimately we get to a happy medium. And I think really that's the best that we can hope for, because you can't, as you said, Jen, measure the impact that some of these things have. How is it possible? Sure, you can did what I did and take some things from the psychological literature that sort of look at measures of religiosity, measures of transcendence, etc. But who would that be useful for? Who would want to know that measurement? The funders are interested in what's happening at the broader society level and what's happening impact wise, which often sort of completely does not correlate with the goals of the project to start with. So there's definite areas of mismatch. And I think if we can provide a midway, a mid path, I think I'd be happy with that, I think. Saurav, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think for me, I think that question of who it's for is important, because from what I've found is, people who engage in interfaith have questions for themselves that they want answered, right? Like they do have sort of really profound questions that, it may not be important to the funder, but it is important to them, and they want answers. I think they also seek, from my experience. So I think evaluation can be a vehicle for that as well. It's like who is this important for? Who is asking this question and for what purpose? So I think I agree with both of you, but I also say I think that question is who is this for is important, and I think we can keep all of that in mind while engaging in this process, and maybe I think the give and take is probably doing an evaluation or engaging in this process with that knowledge and negotiating with your funder while and saying, I'm going to get you answers to these questions that you may have. I also have these questions about my program, about the people, about the project, and my questions are maybe more process oriented. I don't care about what the impact is. I want to know more about the process of how we engaged. And then coming from having worked at a Quaker organization, it's all about the process. They did not care about what the results were. It's all about how do we come into the space together? Who had the ability to speak, for example? Who was in the space to begin with? So it was questions of sort of a little bit of power, of equity, and things of that nature that might necessarily be might not be important to the funder, but it was important to the to the faith organization I was working with. So I think that question of like, who is this for, and who's asking the question, and why? What are we doing with it is, I think, important. And I think, I think evaluation can be a place for that negotiation, and yeah, and I think in general, what I've found is like funders are becoming more and more aware of the sort of the power that they hold. And there's been a whole sort of reckoning of like, are we perpetuating sort of power dynamics? And I think they are being aware of that. And I think hopefully sort of learning to ask those questions, and even like using a toolkit like this, I hope gives sort of grassroots organizations the language to negotiate, with funders, and language to sort of talk to them with, and especially around evidence and impact and evaluation and stuff like that. So that's my thought. I think there's a happy medium definitely there somewhere.
Thank you. I'd just like to sort of throw the conversation back towards Kitty again. Kitty, I think there might be people watching this, or who might watch it in future, who've come to the toolkit, and they might listen to this conversation before delving into your work and the work to put together these indicators. And they might be curious as to some of the concrete examples of some of the measurements that you gave. Some insights into that during your summary presentation, but I just wondered if I could draw you out a little bit. What do you look to measure across the psychological and community domains? Could you give us some examples, and maybe a little bit about how you arrived at your decision to recommend the ones you did?
Yes, of course. Great question. So going back to the evaluation framework, as you alluded to, there are different domains. So looking firstly at the psychological domain of success, the sort of approach that I took really was for questions regarding sort of attitudes, perceptions of the other, black and white thinking. There is an enormous wealth of social psychological literature out there that measures, we're talking going back all the way to 1954 to Allport's contact theory. There's an awful lot of work that's already been done on measuring perceptions of the other, attitude. So really, if it ain't broke, don't go fixing it. So my approach was to take what's been validated from the literature and adapt it for use in the interfaith context. So one of the examples that I showed was a measure that's often used to sort of assess people's strength of affinity with their group. And this was something that came across as quite important for people, this idea that we want to measure or understand what interfaith dialogue does to people's sense of commitment to their own group. Does it diminish it, for example, or is it the contrary? Does it bolster their sense of strength and commitment to their religious group? So using indicators like that have been like pre-validated in the literature is a way of doing that. Some we sort of co-opted from others evaluation frameworks. So I think it's pronounced the Irene database, I'm sure Saurav will correct me if I'm wrong, is this huge, amazing enterprise that was done by the Alliance for Peace Building, which has basically just collated thousands and thousands of indicators. It's this huge indicator bank. And some were selected from there. So it was very much a magpie approach in some cases. If there were some that worked already, that are doing the job quite sufficiently in the interfaith context, then use those as well. Don't reinvent ones that, when you have perfectly good ones available. And then there were ones that I did design specifically for the psychological domain. So one of the things that came through in discussions with practitioners was this idea of what happens to your own sense of self when you undergo interfaith dialogue, which seemed almost sort of contrary to the purpose of interfaith, which is, you're less concerned about the self and more about the other. But people were very interested in understanding how it impacted someone's own sense of religious identity, their own personal faith. What did it do? Sort of interacting with people with different beliefs, for example, do to your own sense of religious identity. Did it bolster it or did it weaken it? So I included some indicators that sort of look at a sense of pride in one's religious group and a sense of confusion around religious identity. And as I said, this is something that was sort of regularly talked about, how for some people, There was an example a lady gave me of an interfaith group in Holland who ran this program between Christians and Muslims and secular individuals. And one lady had to drop out of the initiative because she said it's just too confusing for my sense of identity. I feel so shaken that I can't do this anymore. It's sort of too existentially confusing for me. So by including an indicator like that, we're also capturing sort of negative or unwanted effects, which I also think is actually very important, because yes, if you're playing this funding game, then you obviously want to sort of cherry pick your results, but you have to be honest, you have to be able to account for unexpected outcomes or movements in the unexpected direction. So, and in the community domain, we did a lot of work, myself and Julian, with a very diverse borough in London, and we were lucky enough to sort of attend one of their evaluation sessions for an interfaith forum that they set up. And it was a very interesting experience, I think, because people sort of superficially talked about the use of public space. Parking was a big issue, and on the face of it you think, well, this is just completely irrelevant. This is not, you know, people weren't discussing the finer points of scriptural difference. It was all about who's got parking access where. But going through the recording and the transcript, what's become clear is that it is meaningful. It's about the way that people perceive their faith community's relationship with authority. So how is this public space being divided? Why do some faith communities have more public space than others? And this perception of their strength of belief and their trust in a local authority, I think, is a very important measure at the community level, and will give you some indication of whether or not sort of any interfaith program is working. If there's sort of zero trust in the local authority, then arguably you could say that any interfaith initiative just simply hasn't worked. So yes, things like at the community level, perception of trust and commitment towards a local authority were very important, but also it's one of the things that indicators can do, and I always come back to this whenever I'm sort of a bit unsure, is indicators just give you snapshots that put together will build up a much more fine-grained picture. So even seemingly sort of irrelevant things like, well, how many subsequent interfaith projects have applied for funding? How many people attended? They all seem relatively minor, relatively meaningless, but in combination with others, they do build up this picture, I think, that gives at least some indication of what kind of impact, or how at least the participants are engaging within that interfaith context. So in a nutshell, if I had to, if anyone says to me, how would I develop an indicator for measuring success? I would say, go to the literature, do a big thorough review of what's already out there. You know, as Jen said, a lot of clever people have already done this stuff. So there's a lot out there that doesn't need to be changed. And if you see something that works for you, then I would say use that. In the cases where you do need, because as Sora said, you know, interfaith is intensely context dependent. So the idea of sort of coming up with 20 indicators that could count impact in all different models of dialogue is sort of virtually impossible. So if you do need to develop your own indicators, I think really understanding the context is going to be the best way forward for developing your indicators. So community level indicators in Israel, Palestine, for example, are not going to be looking at issues of parking. I mean, well, maybe they are, I don't know, but I'm assuming that they won't. Whereas in the UK, which is a very, very different context, you'd be looking at these more mundane indicators, but actually put together, they build up this much, much finer picture of what's really happening at the community level.
Just want to add.
Yeah, actually, sorry, I would just like to bring you in there, actually. I'm keen to hear from Jen about whether this midway path might work. But sorry, I just, as we're sort of navigating between the sort of spiritual and the scientific, and as we're sort of thinking about trying to bring these two, dare I say it, into dialogue, I wondered, you mentioned at the beginning that you feel that some of these measures have traditionally been sort of absent from the scene. So when it comes to your work and some of the organisations that you've engaged with, what does success look like? If you haven't been able to rely on the sort of hard science, what do you rely on? What kind of drives your instincts or your kind of gut feeling around whether something is working, is powerful, is effective or not? What's going on there?
Yeah, again, I think it's the question of success for whom is the question. I think that people, yeah, it's like who is asking the question about success? I think that is important to keep in mind as well. But also, like, how can success be defined? I mean, there's a really amazing project actually, and they're partners. We work with them closely. They're called Everyday Peace Building Indicators. So I can share the resources. So it's meeting people where they are. Like, it's letting people define their conception of peace. So the indicator then picks up from what they consider peace, and uses that as an indicator without sort of prescribing a particular indicator to them. So I would like really encourage you to check that resource out. I think the one example that stands out to me, I think, and that I remember from like a webinar I attended or something like that, is like, I don't know, in a community in Uganda, the absence of sort of dogs barking at night was this indicator of feeling a sense of security. Because if there were dogs barking at night, then there would be that's a sort of an indication of sort of disturbances going on in their neighborhoods, right? So they took that as an indicator. And even from my own work, like when I was first starting off getting involved in evaluation work, I was sort of a research assistant for an evaluation that was looking at refugee mental health and psychosocial program. And and it was a refugee mental health psychosocial program that was specifically designed for refugees from Bhutan who speak Nepali. So I got involved because I speak the language, Nepali language, and like I saw all of these surveys, and I was like, some of these words don't even have meaning in Nepali, like it doesn't translate well. So we ended up one of the conceptions of sort of psychological safety that we ended up adopting was, this mental health and psychosocial program was providing English language classes. And it was a very functional English language class. So one of the indicators we ended up using was the ability of the refugees to understand the cross streets, like what cross streets they were in. And if they were able to read, for them, it was a sense of psychological safety because they knew where they were in their neighborhood. If they did not have that functional English language skill, they would not have known where in the neighborhood they were, may have been disoriented or something like that. So we tried to adopt we met folks where they are, talk to them about their conceptions of safety, security, and then adopt an indicator in that way. And I think that's a way that we can define success, is like meet people where they are and let them define it, and then we can do all of the background research work ourselves as researchers, right? So yeah, I would say that.
Great, thank you. First, to come back to Jen for her responses, and then Jen, if you'd like to sort of segue into a quick introduction to the animation, will you be sharing your screen to play it?
Sure, that's
Great.
fine. That's a good
so
method.
Let me first invite you to respond to some of the things that have maybe tried to establish some middle ground between these two worlds. Over to you, Jen.
Cool. I just want to say two main things. One is that, as Saurav said, context is everything, right? So my study was in Rome, where many interreligious initiatives are funded in whole or partially by the Catholic Church as community associations. And of course, under Pope Francis, like the cornerstone of his papacy is pluralism and interfaith dialogue. So the church is in a financial and a doctrinal position to support the moral claims of the interfaith society without having to justify them to a higher funder with proof of progress language or whatever you need for your grant writer in the nonprofit world. So Catholic groups, a lot of which I was talking to, they didn't have to prove their worth or the impact of their use of their funding. So this might really explain why people in a way in Rome are more free to be flippant or dismissive or impatient in the face of measurement questions, which obviously would have driven like my whole sense of conclusion about measurement. But I also want, in a more kind of a broader reflection, to invoke that story, that the analogy of interfaith dialogue that probably all of us have heard like 300 or 400 times in interfaith context, which is the whole thing about the elephant and the three blind guys who are like, oh, the elephant is the tail. Oh, you haven't heard this? It's like they all are blindfolded and they're supposed to touch different parts of the elephant and describe, they're said, this is the world, what is it like? And one of them feels the tail and it's like, well, it's long and it's stiff or whatever. And the other one feels the side is very broad and it's heavy, and the other one feels the trunk, and he's like, it's moving around, let's go to the trees. And like, they're all right because it's all the elephant, but they're all wrong because they're all looking at a partial view of it, right? So I was thinking about this elephant analogy because I want to say, I'm definitely not anti-measurement. I think measuring the socio-psychological return on investment with dialogue is a fascinating, demanding art, which makes practicing or leading interreligious dialogue a truly interdisciplinary craft. And I think measuring is definitely useful, and it's not impossible, because you can come up with indicators and, you know, figure out clever ways to express whether they're achieved. But of course, as I've said, it does only tell a partial story about dialogue. And it also harnesses a set of concepts and methods that in some way are sort of anathema to the faith claims of authenticity and, you know, mutual recognition that dialoguers put forth. So, but it's also, as Katie said, a necessary evil. And I think that leaders and communities of dialogue need these sorts of guidelines and instructional materials like the ones that are provided by the Wolf Institute or by Kaiseed or other groups. So it's good, it's important, it's fascinating, but it's partial. That's my final conclusion.
Great. And would you like to introduce your animation? I think we'll watch the animation and we'll come back for some very, very short closing remarks, just to say good night and goodbye to everybody.
Okay, that sounds good. So this animation is basically a cartoon about my study of interfaith dialogue and my attempt to understand it through measurement. I kind of made it so that my parents could understand what I just spent 10 years of my life trying to write about. And that it's become a very useful thing to share with these communities to talk about issues like measurement.
Interfaith dialogue is when people from different religions come together to strengthen community ties and bridge social divides. Many people say interfaith dialogue is the best method for combating intolerance and forging valuable connections between our broader communities. I thought so too, and I thought it was important to figure out how it actually works and how we can make it better. So, in June 2014, I traveled to Rome, Italy, to learn more specifically about what interfaith dialogue can change and how. This is the story of an ethnographic study of interreligious dialogue in Rome and in the Middle East, detailing how diverse religious groups engage with each other in their search for stronger communities and shared visions of a better future. A Roma, la città eterna. You could say it's a pretty Roman Catholic town, except for the fact that it's also statistically the least Catholic city in Italy, where, although Catholic affiliation may be high, only 25.4% of Italians actually practice the religion. But Rome is historically also a crossroads of East and West. It is a place where, according to various archaeological records and to Mary Beard, an expert on ancient Rome, cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity have existed since the empire, although ancient Roman multiculturalism looked pretty different from modern ideals of cosmopolitan pluralism. Recently, in the decades since the 1970s, millions of people from many countries and religions have flooded into Italy. This has resulted in political and cultural debates about integration, increasing rates of discrimination against foreigners, and a profound change in the social fabric of the once homogeneous Italian peninsula. In many ways, modern Rome is not a city that makes life easy for her citizens. So, Romans who want to use interfaith dialogue to build a healthier, better functioning cosmopolitan capital have a lot of challenges to face. Italian interfaith dialogue started after the Second Vatican Council, a church-wide assembly that introduced Nostra Aetate, a declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions, which acknowledged the validity of other traditions and profess that it is contrary to Roman Catholicism to discriminate on the basis of race, religion, or social class. Since then, there has been a steady increase of interfaith dialogue organizations in Rome. Some are founded within institutions like the Vatican and the Roman city government. Some are non-profit associations, and some are grassroots groups or dialogo di base. Collectively, this interfaith society, as I call the constellation of interfaith dialogue associations in Rome, draws on a variety of forms of dialogue to promote their values of unity and social change. Everything from holding academic conferences to running community blood drives, to civic integration initiatives, to more ceremonial and spiritual affairs, to social gatherings, to athletic events, to making art and music together. I spent about a year hanging out in the offices of Confronti, an Italian magazine about politics, society, and interreligious dialogue. Confronti was founded in 1989, and its history and creative activities are each products of Italian social diversification, political accommodations of the changing population, and the Church's evolution from its Christian ecumenical efforts into its place in today's interfaith society. I also traveled with a group of Confronti journalists to the Middle East to make contact with interfaith organizations, and I was able to interview 25 Muslims, Christians, and Jews who practice dialogue in Israel and Palestine. These interviews really helped show the difference geographical and socio-political context can make in the practice of dialogue. It also showed that dialoguers everywhere tend to speak of dialogue in very similar ways. They speak of their goals in terms of humanizing the other, striving for mutual recognition, and using dialogue for breaking cycles or restructuring historically ingrained cultural habits of stereotyping and objectification. In my research, I found that encounters across religious difference are most effective when they feature clear intention, strong leadership, and sustained repetition in order to establish a safe haven, a peaceful space for encountering different ideas and cultural norms. These practices are best understood not by attempting a concrete measurement of their success, but rather framed as shared sacred values that bind together the interfaith society. In order to better explain the interfaith society, I turned to French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who wrote theories about how societies could maintain their integrity and coherence in the modern era. Durkheim wrote that values form the moral basis of society, and that religion is a source of camaraderie and solidarity. Durkheim defined religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, which unite into one single moral community called a church. Similarly, I describe interreligious dialogue as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred values, which unite people from multiple religions into one single moral community. So you could say that interfaith dialogue is itself a kind of religion, in a Durkheimian sense. The repeated communal invocation of these sacred values signifies to the members of the community that they belong to the collective, solidifying also awareness of who is not in their group. So, what did I find out about what interfaith dialogue can change in the world? How can we know if it's making a clear impact? Well, I actually found that interfaith dialogue cannot be understood by looking for metrics, but rather by examining its practices and asking what they mean for interfaithers. In both the Middle East and Rome, dialogue is revealed to be mostly a process of building meaningful relationships. To understand it, you have to look at all the stories, interconnections, and experiences that populate this moral community. You can't understand interfaith dialogue by asking, Where's the beef? Or by valuing it according to its measurable impact. That's because the product of the dialogue is the dialogue itself. Kinda like the journey is the destination. In Rome, interfaithers promote dialogue in the hopes of restoring to Rome its ancient status as the golden crossroads of civilization. It is their hope that the interfaith dialogue movement sets a positive example that will be seen by the world, so that, when in Rome, and whenever anywhere else, people will do dialogue, as these Romans do.
Great, thank you, Jen.
Just add one quick thing.
Well, actually, we've run out of time, unfortunately.
No
so
problem.
I do appreciate that we could probably talk all evening about this stuff. However, we do have to bring things to a close for numerous reasons. But I would like to thank you, Jen, and I'd also like to thank Saurav for fantastic contributions, really sort of driving the conversation and the debate, the dialogue around this, and also just to sort of pay tribute to Kitty and some great work on completing the Measures of Success toolkit. And I hope people watching as we record this evening and in the future find the toolkit as useful as it was interesting to put together. So thank you for everyone for being with us this evening. Anyone wanting to find out more about the toolkit, anyone wanting the toolkit, just has to go onto the Wolf Institute website and look there. And big thank you to our speakers and a big thank you to our audience. And good night from the Wolf Institute. Goodbye for now.